Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about skill trees. This is a question from Every Nova, not any Nova, Every Nova, who asked, can you please record a video about RPG skill trees? I'm interested specifically in the skill tree as a model for acquiring skills. Different types of skill trees, different point allocation models, even different shapes of skill trees as a different way to force the player into specific choices sometimes. Force was in quotes. You know me, I'm all about player agency. This is an interesting question. I have talked about skill design in RPGs, and there's a video linked below, in general. But this is a different question, and it's very specific to how you arrange the skills. I will start off by saying that most of my games featured very linear skill trees. Here's a set of skills. As you go up in level, you get points, you spend them, and the skill gets just better and better. With occasional things like you could acquire ranks in Arcanum, or you could get skill unlocks in Outer Worlds. In fact, Outer Worlds restricted you early on into only putting points in the skill category. And then when there were enough points, you could then spend them in the sub-skills. For example, dialogue. You could only spend points in dialogue. And then later, I think once you had spent 50 points, it opened up persuasion, persuade, lie, and intimidate. Very specific dialogue skills that could be used in particular places in the game. And then you could spend points directly in that. So those could be considered very short skill trees, maybe skill bushes. See what I did there? But I don't know if people are talking about that. Many games have very, very, very complicated skill trees. Path of Exiles, I'm looking at you. Most games, however, use a tree or maybe a graph or a matrix. All of these are ways to constrain player choices in some way, because the player will pick a skill, and then the next skill they can pick is kind of based on their previous choice. For some of them, it is these skills are prerequisite, so you have to have bought this skill before you can put any points in this one. Some of them you have to put so many points in a particular skill or a set of skills before the next thing in the tree or graph or matrix opens up. This is an interesting way of constraining skill choice. It's very natural, by the way, to show. It's a natural way to show prereqs. If you have a skill that points to another skill, and that other skill is grayed out when you hover over it, it says like you have to spend, 2 or 3 points in the previous skill. People get it. If I were to remake Fallout, I probably, at the very minimum, would let players look at all the perks, because in that game, the perks had prerequisites, but you couldn't see perks until they were offered to you. So I'd let people just look through all the perks they ever wanted to see. And something a little easier than that skill deck, something that you could show a bunch of skills on the screen. You could look at a skill and see all, or perk, and see all the prerequisite perks or links to skills or whatever it is that it required you to have. Just because people like to plan their builds for the entire game, especially after they played the game a few times. Sidebar, I think shapes are something that people understand really well, which is why skill trees and skill graphs work. People naturally get shapes. I've wanted to make a shape-based attribute system for years. I never figured out how to do it. I'm not giving up, because it took me years to figure out how to put flaws in a game that occurred after you began the game. So, games like GURPS have flaws that you buy at the beginning, and it gives you more points to spend on your build right there. It took me a while to figure out how to introduce flaws later in the game that would make people even want to take them. So I haven't given up shapes and attributes, but shapes for skill trees is very much a thing, and many games do it. In fact, I kind of want to talk about the one time I really thought of a relatively complex skill graph, which was for the post-apoc game that Troika was working on called Epic. There's a video about it, and you can watch it in the link below. I was planning to make a skill ability matrix, and I took some notes on how it worked. Now, keep in mind, this was something that I designed in 2004, So it's 20 years old, 21 years old. It's old. So the ability matrix is what I was calling it. It was actually kind of a grid. It contained 4 primary categories: social, thieving, combat, and magic. Each primary category contained a deep, linear list of abilities that were very specific to that category. So it would start off with a base ability, and then each additional ability stayed very specific to that category, but gave you an increase either in power or variety, what you could do it on, or how often you could do it, or something like that. As an example, for the thieving category, the base ability might just be pick simple lock. Pick a simple mechanical lock. And then the next one might be move stealthily. And the next one might be pickpocket. And then you might get pick a more complicated lock, maybe a magical lock, or a complex, something a little more complicated than a simple tumbler. And then it would go all the way up to disappear from view, which is your ability to basically disappear from sight because you're so good at thieving abilities. But the reason these were done as these columns of abilities is each primary category had an adjacent crossover category, which contained abilities that kind of utilized elements from both of the primaries. So, for example, the thieving combat crossover category would have abilities like sneak attack, where the thieving social crossover would have abilities like bluffing and disguise. Note that combat social doesn't directly overlap, and neither does thieving and magic. But there are ways that those skills would be available to someone who wanted them. If you were in thieving and you wanted magic skills, there are ways to get them, and I'll talk about that. The game had multiple starting backgrounds: birth, childhood, and adolescence. And your birth and adolescence backgrounds affected your starting skill category. So I think, for example, I looked it up. If you were a barbarian by birth and you, in your adolescence, you ran with a street gang, you would be presented with thieving and combat as your base skill ability columns. So you could buy those two abilities, the first two abilities in those categories, but you could also pick any of the intermediate, the things that were between it. So the examples here would be, you could choose pick simple lock from thieving, or thrust, with melee thrust from combat, or you could pick from the social thieving crossover, which is bluffing, or the thieving combat crossover, which was sneak attack, or the combat magic crossover, which was a spell called Cloud Mind, which basically made your opponents a little slower and a little more sluggish to attack or notice things. So it was really useful it could be really useful for thieves, but that's not what it was made for. So basically the player was given a choice of their starting skill categories, or they can pick from the crossover categories between them. Each time the player leveled up, they were given the option to choose a new ability off these skill columns. They were offered ones based on what their previous choices were made. So they could progress down a category, each row sequentially, but they could also include abilities from the crossover categories. And if you wanted to, you could go back. So if you crossed over into a category, you could go back down. For example, let's say the thief combat character wanted to get to magic because they wanted that. They could select Cloud Mind, which is the crossover between combat and magic. Then at the next level, they go into magic completely because they have something in the adjoining category. So they can go from Cloud Mind over into a pure combat or pure magic ability, which would be a spell. And then from then on, they could buy spells in the magic system. Similarly, if they wanted to go social, they could pick the thief social ability of bluffing, and then from there, from bluffing at the next level, go into the social category purely. It may not be the most efficient use of their skills, but some people may want to buy all of the low-level abilities and be a generalist, whether it's social, thieving, combat, or magic. Or some people want to deep dive and become a specialist. Epic was going to support both of those. So I hope by talking about the shapes and also by giving you an example, you can see what I'm talking about how the shape helps constrain the kind of player you can make. And I hope this answered your question. Every nova.